we're going to look at, and it pretty much had to be the first topic. I mean, any discussion show in the country, even one that doesn't discuss political issues, I think we should probably start off with this one today. And that is the 7-hour pronouncements yesterday in front of a parliamentary committee by Mr. Dominic Cummings. And for a lot of people, it's this morning, the morning after, so to speak. It's about one of the most fascinating uncoverings of politicians and their behaviour that we've probably experienced in this country, certainly for a very, very long time, because of the nature of BBC Parliament, for example, being able to televise live his every utterance. And for those people who tuned in or saw the snippets across social media or other news channels, it beggars belief how anybody can now turn their heads away and still plead for the innocence of the government. And I know we'll talk about it more in a minute, Tom, but one of the things that really gets me is a phrase that comes out, well, who would have done it better? And it's a frightening phrase, because bearing in mind this country has almost 70 million people in it. The idea that Boris Johnson and Matthew Hancock couldn't do it better than anybody else, or that nobody else in the country could do it better, is, given their track record, it's an extremely frightening one.
I mean, Cummings answered that question himself, Jace. He answered that question himself. He said, in terms of who could lead this country better than Boris Johnson, he said, well, pretty much pick anyone from the top 1% most competent people in the country. Thousands of people that could lead the country better than Boris Johnson is essentially what he said.
But yeah, and if he says that, he is much to blame, because he's basically ruling out 99% of people from a whole range of different backgrounds who, given the decision-making scenarios along the way, many of them, I mean, obviously not all, perhaps, but many of them would probably have, at each juncture where they had to make a proper decision on behalf of the country, would have almost certainly made one that was more beneficial to the country. If we just go, straight to this article, just to identify some of the points that we have that have been made, and this is, thanks to a couple of other independent media outlets in Navarra Media and Spotlight. And this is just a summary of some of the things that were said yesterday. Cummings said Johnson is not fit and proper person to get us through a pandemic. In February 2020, Johnson was referring to the pandemic as nothing more than a scare story and no more serious than swine flu. Cummings claims this is why Johnson missed 5 COBRA meetings. Although actually, Cummings, interestingly, then goes on to say that it's just as well that Johnson did miss those COBRA meetings, given his attitude towards COVID at the time. According to Cummings, Johnson proposed a stunt where he would get the chief medical officer to inject him with COVID live on TV to try and convince people that there was nothing to worry about. I mean, reading it out, you almost think, are these words in the right order? Are they, are they actually saying what they appear to be saying?
We very nearly had Johnson being injected with coronavirus live on TV here, and Trump being injected with bleach live on TV in America. That's how brilliant our world leaders are.
I know, and I suspect there's some people who own these big, massive billionaire media corporations who are thinking about a pay-per-view moment. Around the same time, Johnson was boasting about how he was happily shaking hands with COVID patients. I remember that's Kettering Hospital. It was just horrific. They were also discussing...
It also wasn't true. Can I just say, it also wasn't true. The hospital very clearly came out and said we had no COVID patients. It was just a lie, on top of being obviously completely reckless in terms of the public health message he was putting out. It was also a blatant lie.
Yes. I think it's sort of, we almost need hidden cameras now, don't we, to behind the scenes to find out what they're really thinking and saying, as opposed to the absolute garbage they say when they speak to the media. They were also discussing keeping major sports events and pubs open so more people could mix and mingle and help the virus spread through the population. But we've known that for over a year. You know, we don't need to be told that by Dominic Cummings. The herd immunity theory, which they tried to deny, having said that they were going to do it. You know, Boris Johnson basically went on Good Morning Britain, openly said, you know,
this morning, I think it was.
This morning with Philip Schofield, and basically said this is what they were going to do.
Yeah, take it on the chin.
Take it on the chin.
Let it spread through the population, as it were, and take it on the chin. And of course, 150,000 people have taken it on the chin.
Yeah, well, of course, many more, including the ones who are experiencing long COVID, etc.
Yeah.
Johnson was determined to pursue herd immunity and was angry about being forced into the first lockdown by advisors. So you have advisors around you, and yet you didn't like the advice he was getting. In fact, according to Cummings, even by summer of 2020, as cases were rising dramatically, he was still ignoring the scientific advisors and pushing to end lockdown. So that, again, you know, is that the people who are properly at the Conservative Party, the donors, the lobbyists, etc., who were threatening to take the money away? Or were they effectively the ones who had their hands so far up his anal passage that he couldn't think for himself? Who knows? At one point, they were discussing something similar to chickenpox parties as a way to encourage less vulnerable kids to get together and allow themselves to get infected in order to quickly progress herd immunity, even if that meant making the older population even more vulnerable. Apparently, a few hundred older folk dying would be a sacrifice worth taking. He claims Johnson said, "I should have been the mayor of Jaws and kept the beaches open." He also claims, I mean, that might explain why Jaws was trending so highly on TV the other night. He also claimed Johnson said he'd rather see the bodies pile up high than go into a third lockdown. Well, we've heard that already. Most people who are clued up and have your mug, Tom, they would know that that's exactly the thing that Johnson says. The Secretary of State, the Chief Scientific Advisor, and the Chief Medical Advisor were briefing Laura Kuenssberg, well, what a surprise, Robert Peston and other key media people on what Cummings called the single peak herd immunity by September plan, and Sage were mentioning it on TV. So, you know, we knew that Kuenssberg and Peston, we knew that they were just effectively reading out press briefings that were handed to them by the government. There was no analysis, investigative journalism, critique, and we know by their reputation now that they're just puppets.
Yeah, and before you just move on, I must give credit here to we must acknowledge the scientific community around the world, because when it became fairly common knowledge around the scientific community globally that our government was pursuing a herd immunity policy, you know, eminent scientists around the world screamed and shouted, "No, that will be like committing mass murder. That's crazy. That's reckless. That is not how you respond to this kind of pandemic that's you know, going to prove incredibly deadly, and you must change plan." And you know, I read a whole load of scientific articles, some of which were published in the Lancet, etc., where scientists around the world, but virologists and pandemic specialists around the world were saying, you know, your government are crazy if they do this, and they'll be responsible for mass murder, and you've got to stop. And you know, I think the scientists shouting that truth out, was very much responsible for making the government change plan, as well as, of course, our own scientists at Imperial who crunched the numbers, you know, and told the government it was going to lead to absolute mass death in a short space of time. So well done to the science community for calling that out as literally a crazy policy.
Yeah, and the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, And the World Health Organization. What is the point of setting up the World Health Organization with all the money and investment, all of those, scientific minds across the spectrum coming together and then ignoring them? And yet other countries, of course, stuck quite rigidly to the World Health Organization's dictums and advice, and their body counts are next to nothing. So what is it that was going on within the minds of the people at the top in the UK government that meant that they thought that they knew better?
Well, I mean, one of the things, I know you go on and say some of the other things that Cummings said, but one of the things that's very clear from the testimony, and we've kind of known all along, is that Johnson and this brand of particularly right-wing conservatives are beholden to the interests of capital. Very wealthy people, mostly from America, have put them where they are, support them, fund them, give them vast amounts of money. And can take them down if they wish. People like Murdoch, people like Matthew Elliott from America, those are the all-powerful people behind our politicians who can take them down at the drop of a hat if they so wish. So so when these crucial decisions are made, people think Johnson will be talking to Public Health England, he'll be talking to his MPs and coming up with the best possible policy to benefit the British people the most. No, he's not. He's talking to Murdoch, he's talking to Matthew Elliott and saying, if I do this, will you still support me? I mean, that was undoubtedly what happened with Cummings and Barnard Castle. Why did Johnson support him with that? And people think, well, Johnson probably phoned round his MPs and got their opinion. No, he'll have been phoning Murdoch and Matthew Elliott, and of course Cummings is a favourite of theirs. And saying, if I sack him, will you still support me? They obviously said no, so he didn't sack him. So we've seen all along that the decisions taken are in the interests of profit over people.
Yes.
And that kind of sums up our government's response throughout. And clearly, as evidence from what Cummings was saying yesterday, clearly that was what was foremost in Johnson's decision making at all times. Was what's they call it best for the economy. It's not best for the economy. It's best for the very, very rich people who are funding him and supporting him, who exploit workers and make vast profits.
And so much was exposed yesterday by Dominic Cummings. We, us too, and many, many, many others who have been critically assessing what's in front of them over the last year, 5 years, 10 years, we're not surprised because most of us have been saying pretty similar things ourselves. So the single peak herd immunity by September plan is also on all the official documents. Johnson was determined not to implement a border policy, again, ignoring advisors and choosing to listen to the Daily Telegraph and Tory backbenchers. Cummings was also scathing about Matt Hancock and said he was in fact an habitual liar and should have been fired many times over. That's not a surprise to anybody. I'm surprised there's anybody out there who believes that anything he says is the truth.
And he described Hancock's actions as criminal.
Yes,
which was an interesting choice of words. And of course, he also said that, that ridiculous time at the end of last April when Hancock had set that arbitrary figure of doing 100,000 tests and manufactured achieving that, so as he called it, successfully reaching that target on the last day of April. And he did that through a whole variety of cheating methods, including counting every test. So if someone does 2 tests, then they count both. Writing to Tory members, asking them all to ask for a test to be sent to them. And of course, every test sent out was recorded rather than every test completed.
Yeah.
And other things. I mean, 60-something thousand tests were actually done on that day. They claimed it was 100,000, but I mean, Cummings was scathing of that and said that lives were lost because of that, because of Hancock's obsession with trying to prove that he'd reached that arbitrary target in such a manufactured way.
And it shows how undemocratic we are, Tom, because we expose that. I mean, Dorset Eye is just one of many that exposed that over a year ago, and yet nobody wants to listen to us apart from those people who are genuinely interested in what's going on and generally have an open mind about, you know, what the power structures in and around them are up to. For most people, they weren't fed this by the corporate media. They weren't fed this by politicians who have the clout to really make a sound and a loud voice. So how democratic are we? How democratic is it that when the horse is bolted and it sits down in front of a bunch of politicians within a committee and exposes the very things that we've exposed month on month for well over a year? And that's the frightening thing, because these people are now dead. You can't bring these people back. And yet they could still be alive if those people who have the power and the influence put us first and not themselves, not their own egos. According to Cummings in the summer 2000, Hancock declared that everyone who needed treatment was getting the treatment they required, despite the fact that he'd been briefed differently by both the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer. In mid-April 2020, Hancock told the Cabinet Office that PPE had been sorted. Excuse me, it quickly transpired this was not the case. When NHS staff and care workers reported they were running out, Hancock then attempted to shift the blame onto Simon Stevens, Chief Executive of NHS England, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, and suggested they'd blocked approval of supply contracts. However, when the Chief Cabinet Secretary investigated this claim, it was proven to be a lie. The Cabinet Secretary then told Cummings and Boris Johnson that they'd lost all confidence in the Secretary of State's honesty at Cabinet meetings. I mean, he's just a wheezy little kid. That's what he is, Matthew Hancock. He is. He's a little weasel. He doesn't like taking responsibility because he's probably never had to. Cummings claims that Hancock also lied when he told the Cabinet Office that people would be tested for COVID before they would be returned to care homes. We now know that this has killed thousands of people. According to Cummings, he was getting reports from various sources that Hancock was interfering with the test and trace system because he wanted to rig it in a way to show he was hitting targets when he wasn't, which exactly says what you just discussed, Tom. Cummings said he repeatedly told Johnson to sack Hancock, but other advisors were telling him not to sack him because they could use Hancock as a fall guy when the inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic finally came around. Well, this is what we were talking about last week, isn't it? He's setting up the straw men, straw people to take the whack. Then the media clamor all around that for 2 or 3 days, and then they move on. Although keeping him in office was likely to result in even more unnecessary deaths, this was acceptable because it gave the government a way to shirk responsibility and blame. I mean, that in itself, that's a criminal activity.
Absolutely.
It's like so many people on social media have been saying, Tom, you know, these people just should be locked up.
Yeah. So in
other words, can I just do the last point before you can just do the last point?
Yeah.
Cummings also produced an image of a whiteboard in the PM's office on the 13th of March 2020, showing that, among other things, they were talking about the likely collapse of the NHS if they didn't come up with a proper plan. And one of the points under discussion was who to not save. And then, please, I mean, there's a 1 hour 25 video and people thinking, oh, I can't go through 1 hour 25. Just set aside 1 hour 25 minutes at some point very, very soon and go through this with an open mind. You know, I guarantee you that if you do that, then you're going to come out a lot wiser about what's really going on in this country. And for those people who want to know and be exposed to what's really going on in terms of what Cummings said yesterday, this is a brilliant place to start.
So staggering that that revelation that Hancock's so incompetent and so deceitful that that he was, according to Cummings' testimony, he was costing lives. His actions were leading to a lot of people dying. and the decision from Johnson was, and Johnson's people around Johnson advising him, was keep Hancock in position so that he can be the one that takes the blame when there's an inquiry and the fingers pointed at you. You can use him as the fall guy, as the patsy, blame everything on Hancock and get rid of him then. But in the meantime, it's fine to keep him in place, even if that's costing thousands and thousands of lives due to his incompetence and his lies. That's just an absolutely staggering revelation.
And I don't know if you've seen what's going on this morning, Tom, but he's stood up at the dispatch box in Parliament denying the whole lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So who's the liar here? Because it's like somebody very clearly, the point very, very clearly made on social media. If Cummings is lying across the board, then Boris Johnson's judgment is seriously impaired because he was the one who invited him into number 10 as a chief advisor. If Matthew Hancock is lying across the board and Cummings is telling the truth, Boris Johnson is the one that put Matthew Hancock in a position in the Department of Health, and he stood by him throughout the whole pandemic instead of finding someone much more competent.
Yeah.
So either way, Boris Johnson is guilty on all charges of absolute incompetence, not to mention everything else.
Absolutely. And of course, Cummings went on to talk about, not just Johnson's reluctance to lock down the first time, but then there was a lot of testimony yesterday about what happened in the early autumn and Johnson's absolute reluctance to lock down, despite all the scientific advice, saying a circuit breaker lockdown is essential now. 2-3 week lockdown is essential now. If you don't do it, there's going to be mass death. You'll need to lock down stricter, harder, and for longer in a few weeks. And he ignored all the advice, because I'm sure he would have been listening instead to the people that just want to make profit and don't care if tens of thousands of people die. And he ignored the advice and once again failed to lock down. We saw it again over Christmas, and finally a lockdown again in the new year was forced. We're seeing it again now with the Indian variant and him being too slow to act to close the borders to flights coming in from India. I mean, every single time Johnson reacts or decides to take action way too late, again and again and again, never learning from his mistakes, belligerently thinking he's somehow doing the right thing. I mean, it's a shocking tale of repeated incompetence and arrogance, belligerence. It's really staggering, and for him to be saying things like "I'd rather let the bodies pile high," it's just atrocious. It's inhumane. And of course, one of the things that we've very clearly seen is throughout the pandemic, the Tories have come on, particularly on the coronavirus sort of press conferences, and said and made these repeated statements that they are following the science. And it's been very clear throughout that they're mostly not following the science. And from Cummings' testimony yesterday, it's absolutely 100% clear that Johnson and others are directly contradicting the science, being given scientific advice and rejecting it. And we need to make that really clear to the public. The public need to be aware of that. That some of the things that they say again and again and again as a mantra, we're following the science, is absolutely untrue. And the public should be aware of that, and then think about the 150,000+ deaths we've had.
Right, and I think that's a great place to stop.